right, ladies and gentlemen, everyone around and in between. This is DebateSensei NFA LD edition, where we delve into sort of the intricacies of NFA LD debate. And we have our resident expert, Chad Meadows, with us to do so. Thank you so much, Chad, the director of debate from Western Kentucky University.
Excited to be here, Jared, and pumped to talk about the negative.
Yeah.
The negative was kind of like my favorite position when I debated, so it's definitely a passion of mine.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start because I really did appreciate that as well. So I did NPDA, and usually what there would be is like you would switch off who did the lead, and so like it's kind of the same thing for most debates. But I always appreciated strategizing for that one NC. That one speech was fun. And like we were just talking about how it's different than the affirmative because like the prep seems a little different where I don't know how you did it, but the way I did it was where I prepped out like a menu of options, and then as I'm hearing the one AC, I'm kind of like selecting which ones are going into my presentation.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the challenge of the negative is that you have to prepare more arguments than you could possibly fit into your speech, and on the fly, in response to what the affirmative's content includes, you're building your negative constructive speech as you go. Now, in LD and in policy, there's a little bit more predictability to it, especially once you get into the season, with disclosure, making it to where, like, in some cases you'll know what the affirmative case is going to be in advance. But where we are now at the preparation stage before the first tournament, no one has a clue.
Right.
So everyone's just furiously prepping as many negative arguments as they can, trying to get in the head of everyone else and anticipate what they're going to read. So it's an interesting process.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a good place to go because just so everybody knows, we're recording this before the first tournament. So this episode's really more about speculating about good negatives that you should be prepared for, or you should prepare yourself, right? That you should know that it's coming, or you should it's something that's fairly obvious. We'll see how that plays out once this is actually aired.
Yeah, it would be a fun episode to later look at some of these speculations and assess how accurate they really are.
And I just noticed that we're wearing the same color shirt. That's hilarious.
Totally intended, I'm sure.
All right. So I don't always start with usually I start with disadvantages. Usually that's where I would start, you know what I mean? And I think some people think that's a little bit backwards, where I have my disadvantages first, if we're just doing policy, right? And then I work backwards and develop topicality positions that are sort of like form the foundation of why the disadvantage is legit and stuff like that. I've always wondered if that process was similar to other coaches or competitors.
Yeah, I think that it could depend on the way the resolution is written, but I do know a lot of people start with T. A lot of directors of debate, they like to take the T file first,
right?
Because hopefully, if you do the T file, the dimensions of the resolution become a little bit more clear, and you're able to kind of anticipate, which negative arguments you really have to prepare for. I don't really do it that way. I'm more on your side. I kind of prefer to just like look at the resolution. I don't really make a file for topicality. I more so just think about, what are the different buckets that, affirmatives are going to fit into. And then I kind of, start filling out what our negative might look like, given those different buckets. And, I think writing dissides is a great place to start. And one thing that I think that you can, do is you can basically say, okay, so if I write this dissad, how many varieties of affirmative that I think that are going to be written is this dissad going to be relevant again?
Right.
A lot of them, then yeah, it's a good investment of time. If it's not, even if it's a cool dissad, it doesn't matter because the circumstances under which you're likely to get to use that argument are just, not super high. So, that's why I think you see a lot of generic disadvantages to start the season, is because, people have a limited amount of time. Coaches are busy, students are busy, everyone loves debate, but there are other things in your life. And so you've got to prioritize writing arguments that you believe will apply to the vast majority of affirmative cases.
Right. So yeah, I've always found that like if you prep out those dissets that the topicality positions just kind of reveal themselves, right? And he's like, I know, like T though, it's kind of, I think the reason that they go for their files, if you have those back files, I think it might be a product of me coming out of limited preparation debate. You know what I mean? Where it's like you're trying to, I don't know, you got less time, but also you don't have this whole library of arguments that well, you didn't at the time I was doing it, I guess. They kind of do it now. But yeah, it seemed to kind of be a really organic way of doing it. And so, yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So if I were conceptualizing doing it that way, kind of what I would think is, okay, so if I'm going to write the major arguments on the topic, the major disadvantages on the topic.
Right.
Essentially, any affirmative that doesn't link to that doesn't pass the smell test.
Right.
A topical affirmative. And then from there, you can be like, okay, which word are these kinds of affirmatives that don't link to these basic disads? What word do they violate, or what definition can we come up with that would sort of attempt to exclude these affirmatives and keep the case list one that the majority of the neg generics linked to? I think that's a definitely interesting way to do it, and I think a cool way to do it.
Okay, so let's you know what? Let's do it that way then. Let's try that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to incorporate ChatGPT even more into these episodes as a way of sort of bouncing ideas off it. And I asked it to just generate a list of disads for this topic. All right. Now let's go. I'll do the number one, but I want to hear what your number one is that you think is like, all right, this one's just solid. What would you call your disad?
So if you look up the nuclear posture review and kind of discern what's the number one reason why America maintains a potent nuclear arsenal, it's to deter our adversaries from taking actions which are antagonistic toward the United States. So, I think deterrence DA would have to be the number one disadvantage that would come up on nuclear weapons topic.
There it is. Deterrence. Yeah. So ChatGPT put number one was the deterrence also. So it's like you're not giving away any secrets by prepping.
No.
So all right, let's talk about that. What is let's break down what makes a good deterrence disadvantage. All right.
Yeah. So to me, if you want to think about what makes a good deterrence disadvantage, the first thing you've got to do is eliminate the ambiguity associated with the term deterrence. What does that truly mean? And basically, if you think about it, deterrence just means that we can prevent actors from taking actions that they otherwise would have taken because of the fear of a response from the United States, right? Okay, so basically we're talking about making other countries, making the cost of actions that America doesn't want them to take so high that they wouldn't take those actions. So the first thing that I think a good deterrence dissent does is that it explains why are nuclear weapons a central or a necessary foundation for American deterrence. Because obviously America has other weapons, right? We've got tanks, we've got planes that carry bombs that aren't nuclear weapons. We've got satellites. We've got all kinds of, crazy kooky stuff that we spend billions and billions of dollars to figure out how to scare everyone the most, right? Right. So why are nuclear weapons so important to deterrence? And I think that is sort of the central question that a lot of affirmative authors will push back on, that the negative needs to be really prepared to argue. Right. Because most affirmative authors who are advocating against the role of nuclear weapons, they're not like naive hippies, right? They understand that, international relations is an environment characterized by security concerns. And a lot of times what they're arguing is that, well, we don't need nuclear weapons, the bomb, the sort of like big end-all, war machine that could kill everyone. We don't need that to convince our adversaries to not take actions we don't like. We've got other things that we can use.
So this is all the uniqueness stuff, like, or at least the explaining what deterrence means, right?
Yeah,
like that's uniqueness level stuff. Would you just get down to like the country level? You just be like, we're talking Russia, China, North Korea, Iran.
Like, yeah, I mean, I think so. In terms of countries that I think that America seems to be very concerned with deterring their actions, aka countries that want to take actions that we want to deter. Mm-hmm. You're talking about Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. You're talking about non-state or what we might call rogue state actors. And then you're talking about, I think I mentioned North Korea. And so those are, I think, the primary ones that we're concerned with. If you kind of examine, Department of Defense strategy documents that have been released in the past, year or two since Biden, even a little bit at the end of the Trump administration, there's a huge emphasis of shifting away from the Obama era that was characterized by counterterrorism to an era characterized by great power competition, meaning that there sort of like is a clash between the great powers of the world, the United States on one side, NATO being an ally of the US, and then Russia and China sort of like representing the antagonistic force against the post-World War II allies, right? So I think those countries and the ones aligned with them are kind of the ones that I think that we're most likely to try to deter. And then, of course, every region's kind of got its spoiler countries, I call them, countries that maybe aren't great powers, but are definitely not allied with the United States. Iran, North Korea is really good examples of that.
Disadvantages sometimes, the make or break moment is the link level. All right. So like having so you can set it up. It's like, all right, this is deterrence, but now once we reduce the number and or roll to a substantial amount, like telling a convincing link story is like critical. What do you think that link story is going to be? How specific does it need to be?
I think at first it's going to be very generic. I think you're going to look at authors that take the most extreme stance with regard to maintaining our current nuclear arsenal. The ones who are like, any reduction sends the wrong signal, any decline is bad. And those are in relative abundance. America, for the most part, is not looking at reducing its nuclear weapons or reducing the centrality of nuclear weapons in its current strategy, especially as we transition to our, sort of like largest strategy being focused on competition with nuclear armed our adversaries. Nuclear weapons are, I think, taking on a position of greater importance to the United States security strategy, not the opposite direction. Right. And that also is, relevant because our adversaries are also increasing the extent to which they rely on nuclear weapons. China is dramatically increasing its nuclear arsenal. Russia has basically pulled out of all of the Cold War or post-Cold War arms reduction treaties that they had signed on to. So there's definitely, I think, a little bit of a revival of nuclearism in security rhetoric.
Okay. So like, man, like even if you have the same topic, 5-10 years apart, like it's a different debate every time, like the trajectory that you're going and things like that. Oh man, it's I don't know. So if you're getting on that level, sometimes it's going to be generic. But you think it kind of tightens up over the year, like those link stories?
Yeah, I think so. Generally, like what we try to do is whenever we first start, we aren't trying to be as specific as possible. Okay. We're trying to cast a wide a wide spectrum. So, when you start, I like to be like, wide as a mile, deep as an inch, right?
Mhm.
Like you want to just like get a little taste of like every part of the literature base, because the worst case scenario is you're in a debate, the AF goes, you don't know what the AF is, you don't have anything to say against it, and you're just like done before the round starts.
Yeah.
Right. That's the worst case scenario. So whenever you first start out, having something to say is kind of, I think, the goal of your preparation. And then as you kind of acknowledge which disadvantages are the best and the ones that apply to the most as, maybe deterrence is that, you start to add in those links. So it's like, okay, if there's like a bunch of affirmatives that deal with ICBMs, we need an ICBMs card. If there's a bunch of affirmatives that deal with nuclear submarines, we need some subs cards, right?
Yeah.
I think like you start to build those files as the season goes along, and make those arguments better throughout the course of the year.
The way I was taught disadvantages was to have a brink, but then it kind of over my career it just kind of turned into an internal link, and a lot of things were linear disadvantages and things like that. Nuclear debates kind of have, I think, a higher potential to include really clear brinks, and it also seems like that would be what ties to the topicality at that point. Like, what is a substantial amount? As soon as you hit like maybe getting rid of a few like nuclear weapons, like some outdated ones, but maintaining all the others, doesn't pass that brink that that triggers the impacts. Is my intuition correct that there's probably a lot more brink literature out there than most?
I mean, I definitely think so. First of all, because most people who are writing about nuclear weapons aren't writing from the perspective that they sort of like portend that America should have no nuclear deterrence. So there's really a debate about the extent to which nuclear weapons should play a role in foreign policy, and where those brinks are, I think, are negotiated, in the rounds. There are some extreme authors who are like, no nukes ever, and that's good. But I think for the most part, most authors are debating that brink. How many nuclear weapons do we need? What declaratory policies are the most ideal with regard to reducing nuclear risk? And I think brinks are incredibly important when the AF and the NEG also are going to have, in a sense, the same impact, right? Like from the affirmative, they're trying to prevent nuclear war. From the negative, they're trying to prevent nuclear war. So what's really being debated is the link, right? So I think on this topic, the link and the brink and the relationship between those two sort of concepts take on utmost importance in terms of who will ultimately win. Also, in regard with the brink, I think that the brink of the impact also matters too. One thing that I'm going to harp on this year as a judge is, I don't want scenarios where I can't identify who shoots first, right? If you're telling me there's a U.S.-China nuclear war, okay, so like, how does that happen? Who launches a nuclear weapon first, and what motivation do they have to take those actions, right? So, I think that there's also a need on this topic when we're all talking about the chance of nuclear war to really start specifying out those scenarios. What causes what leads us to this precipitous decline in the nuclear taboo and leads towards nuclear use that hasn't been contemplated or done since the 1940s.
Yeah, the appeal of going toward high magnitude impacts, like, I think draws people in. I don't know if it's just my age or something, but I start heading towards the higher probability impacts, and I tend to lead with those ones. And as I put that into ChatGPT, I'm like, hey, generate this and give me some impacts. The first impact it had was not nuclear war, but just like military conflicts, increased militarism and stuff like that. So it's like, you don't have to have a breakout of nuclear war in order to have impacts. You know what I mean? And I think, man, if I was coaching, I think I'd be coaching my students to go for that first, especially in light of the Russia-Ukraine conflict going on. It's like, hey, like, if you want to prolong that and increase the number of those, that's the impact that you're looking at. That's way more likely than any even though Putin is threatening nuclear weapons, it's still like you can guarantee, like the chances I think are much higher for that. What's your feeling about like the probability magnitude issue when it comes to disadvantages?
I think as you get older, the sense that debate is an educational activity and not a game kind of makes you lean more towards wanting to see realistic impacts. The place that I've settled is, this. Whether or not the impacts are big or small, I want to see debates that, to me, look similar-ish to the academic literature that is informing the resolution. And I understand that debate is creative. Debaters have their own thoughts. They want to go to some outsider places in terms of the content that they generate. But as a judge and as just like a member of the community, I think that debate does it the best when students leave the resolution really well informed on the sort of like major controversies regarding the topic from a variety of perspectives. And that doesn't just mean only the policy analysis. There's a whole side that's a critical engagement with nuclear weapons that I think it would be a shame if students also didn't leave with. There's from the 1960s an African American nuclear disarmament movement that I hope students have some interaction with. And and I think I mentioned on the last episode that that's the beauty of debate. It's that since everyone brings their own perspective and brings a lot of different stuff to the table, my hope is that you basically leave having essentially taken a class on nuclear weapons from professors from 5 different disciplines. Your humanities class on nuclear weapons, your international affairs class on nuclear weapons, maybe a selected topics on nuclear weapons from your econ department, right? Hopefully you're getting a taste of every perspective. And that's what I want to see, and that tends to mean that if the impacts aren't small in magnitude, they're at least the well represented, the big impacts that are like the most likely.
Yeah. We might go a little over it with your permission. We talked a lot about the disadvantage, but it is the most important position in my opinion. You know what I mean? So that's good. But I do want to talk about what sort of like critical positions the negative can come up with. If you were going to predict like a very likely critique that the negative would be rolling out, what are your thoughts?
I kind of previewed it before, but I think that there are 2 critical positions that I think are really important to bring up. So the first one I'll talk about is securitization theory. So there's a whole school of authors and academics who are writing about what is the reason why international relations is so wrought with conflict and acrimony. Is it the sort of like just minute policy details, or is it sort of the nature of the way that we talk about international relations, the way that we kind of see it as a field dominated by state governments and not people? And I think there's a challenge to the traditional frame of international relations, characterized mostly by like realists, who are sort of like arguing that the way that we securitize the issues actually creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. When I say securitize, I basically mean that we make everything an issue concerning security, and it's almost like a if everything you see is a nail, then the only thing you have is a hammer, right? It's sort of like the way that we have sort of like made every impact, and especially in debate, made every impact, a nuclear war extinction impact actually leads to some problematic policies. And I think security studies will be, a big part of this topic.
Now, so how does that work when the affirmative comes back around? is there a potential to turn that? Because nuclear weapons in and of themselves seem to be the hammer. You know what I mean? I'm not particularly familiar with how it plays out in the round, but is that a danger?
Yeah, I mean, I think the app on this particular topic is like pretty well suited to answer critiques.
Okay.
But I think that there's a decent chunk of the security literature that sort of like describes actions that on face appear to be diminishing the sort of like machinations of the security infrastructure, the militarism infrastructure, but that sort of like don't deal with the root causes that created those problems to begin with.
Okay.
So like a good example, is that there's a decent chunk of literature that deals with President Biden's decision to leave Afghanistan. And ostensibly, that was a move that, desecuritized the Middle East. But it came sort of like alongside a whole cadre of drone efforts and destabilizing moves. And, there's also a lot of analysis that was done about the whole, war on terrorism and how sort of like the way that we replaced permanent military presence with technology is sort of like representative of the way that shallow reductions of militarism can, in some ways, serve to reinscribe militarism in more subtle and nefarious ways. And I think that can happen with nuclear weapons too, right? I mean, nuclear weapons isn't the only way to end the world. If that makes sense. And so, there's all these weapons and different techniques that could replace nuclear weapons, where you're talking about, hypersonic weapons, you're talking about, horrible, like biological, chemical weapons. There's a whole spectrum of ways to sort of like commit violence that maybe are not done away with if the only thing that we examine when we think about getting rid of militarism is just the specific technologies that it manifests in.
Okay, so I even had ChatGPT. So that was Chat's top critique as well. And I asked it, so I like doing the follow-ups. I asked it to kind of wrap it in more IR theory. So I'm interested in. I gravitate towards alternatives. When I hear critiques, I'm like, okay, that's great. It's like, and I know that there is contention about how essential the alternative is within a critique, but still, I love them. That's where I feel like I learn something almost every time. You know what I mean? Especially just seeing how people apply alternatives to the same topic, and I'm like, oh man, that's a really great. Do you have thoughts on alternatives to the securitization approach?
Yeah, I think it will relate in two ways. The first is that I think that there will be alternatives that are related more toward the sort of epistemic foundation of debates, not just like debate in, like intercollegiate debate, but like debates that happen in the academic and nuclear policy community. I think that there will be alternatives that are about how we need to let in perspectives on nuclear weapons that aren't just, academic or prestigious institutions that represent the previously colonized countries that, represent, decolonial strategies and indigenous people and people from different backgrounds. And I think that will be one. And it'll be kind of like before we can talk about what particular policies that we, enact to get rid of nuclear weapons, we need to let in the people who have had the sort of like most disproportionate impact from nuclear weapons into those debates. I think that there will be, some discussion about, attempts to maybe like abolish nuclear weapons or, maybe just kind of like enact a more radical way of like doing what the affirmative does and kind of get into your, like reformism versus abolition kind of debate, a lot of times, the way that critiques work, especially if they're sort of like more focused on alternative and like what is the pragmatic strategy. Now, you might see some debates that are like, if we just keep chipping away at this thing, then we get rid of all the political energy and momentum that we need to kind of get rid of all of it. So instead of focusing on, chipping away and doing things like the plan, all of our energy, all of our focus, all of our efforts need to go towards just abolishing nuclear weapons.
Okay. So it's yeah, I always love that, because if you just stick with a policy framework, it starts really crowding people out, with different alternative arguments. And so what normally would be like a non-competitive counterplan in a policy framework is a like substantive debate in a critical framework. You know what I mean? I think it's just like, I'm like, that's great. That's great. It's because I think what it does is it actually enhances debate. It allows for more avenues to happen. And yeah, that rest on good disciplined research techniques.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So yeah, it's awesome. You said that there was another critique though, other than securitization.
Yeah, I think I talked about that one a couple episodes ago, but the settler colonialism critique, I think, will be big. A big question regarding nuclear weapons and getting rid of them is, well, what do we do with the waste? What do we do with those nuclear weapons? Historically, those waste products, those nuclear weapons have poisoned indigenous communities. A lot of nuclear testing was done in indigenous communities. So there's a lot of relationship, I think, between a debate about nuclear weapons and the risk that it in some way ends up becoming colonial or neo-colonial in nature and hurting indigenous communities. And so yeah, I think that I've come across quite a few articles that are exploring that relationship between settler colonialism and nuclear weapons.
You thinking that's going to be a fairly popular critique? You're going to run into it?
I think that one's going to be pretty popular. I think, like, first of all, like, it's just, if you're kind of like in those circles, those
Right.
those leftist circles, I think that's something that is pretty common as like an objection to at least nuclear energy. And so, I think a lot of people are kind of aware of that issue. And then once you start to do some research on it, you'll find, okay, there's some good cards here, there's some good evidence. So yeah, I think that settler colonialism will be a big critique on the topic.
All right, cool. Yeah, I did that too. So when you said that, I generated it, and it's awesome. So I mean, even ChatGPT kind of knows how to frame up a critique. I wouldn't say that it's I wouldn't say that it's open level. Like, it seems kind of like a good novice introduction to critiques. And so it starts off with the state-centric framework, and nuclear territoriality. But like I said, I like going, the impacts, obviously, about like indigenous sovereignty and epistemic violence and stuff. But the decolonial turn, colonial turn. Do you understand what that means just by that phrase alone? Like, would you be able to?
So I would probably like infer that by decolonial, they would either be referring to sort of like a tangible repatriation of land by states that are settler colonial countries like the United States. Or I think that there is also a more metaphorical decolonial turn that could happen, which may like refer more toward sort of like upending the way that knowledge from colonial society dominates the discussions, and kind of foregrounding some more of the knowledge and perspectives on nuclear weapons that come from indigenous communities. That's what I would guess that they're talking about.
It seems that way. Yeah. Prioritizes indigenous sovereignty, epistemologies, and worldviews. And so that would be now. What's the danger of a permutation in that one from the affirmative, the 1AR?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what the affirmative I would try to suggest that the affirmative would do is to basically argue that affirming doesn't trade off with the injection of a new perspective into debates regarding nuclear weapons, right? I think the challenge with that permutation, though, is if we've already assumed what the conclusion is, have we really taken on a different perspective, or have we just kind of, added indigenous perspective and stirred and said, okay, we added it, now let's do what we want to do to begin with, right? Right. I think that's kind of like the answer to those permutations is like, well, you can't say that you've taken on a new perspective. if it doesn't change anything with regard to how you went about doing what you wanted to do in the first place.
Okay. Some good stuff. And I didn't realize how long we can speak about each one of these things. It's great. I think that's a testimony to the topic itself a bit, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a complicated topic. And I didn't even go into my rant about World War II and how it's still structuring all politics.
Oh, man, I'm sure we're gonna have space for that discussion. We're gonna figure that out. So join us on our next episode, everyone. Thank you so much, Chad, for this discussion. I think it went very well.
It was good to talk to you.
All right. See you later, everyone.